What are the best prehab movements to prevent injury? For example, crossover symmetry.
Yep. I would say, so this is one thing we mentioned before about how do you keep getting better with your like service or your product. So warm up is something that we really adapted a lot, probably like 3 or 4 years ago. And now as you know, and you're very like aware of these things, but most of our athletes probably don't even know. Like they're like, oh, we go in and we do the warm up and we talk about the thing. But it's basically always unilateral work. And so we do some sort of single arm, single leg stuff basically every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes we do them in the strength and the conditioning, but like every day we hit it in some capacity in the warm up. And I think that that is something that is hopefully evolving for the positive in our industry, right? Like things like crossover symmetry, things like now it's hard. It's some like we have a couple of those. We don't have like 12 of those. So we don't use them every day in warm up.
Sorry, can you explain crossover symmetry?
Yeah, so crossover symmetry is like a rotator cuff and shoulder like warm up and strengthening tool. And since we do so much overhead work in CrossFit, we actually the sort of developer of it is actually in Denver. And so if your gym has crossover symmetry, like we know the I just randomly happened to go to the PT that they own the company or related to the programming of the company. And so that's like a warm-up device, cool down device. It is something that like you've taken barbell club with Dalton before. The iron scap is like, that's like considered there's like a fine line between strength and prehab, right? And so with things like shoulder stuff, like rehabbing or prehabbing prior to any overhead is something that we try to be aware of. Can we do it better? Of course, right? Like everyone could do more of the stuff, right? But if we're in an overhead squat day, we usually will have some sort of PVC work in the warm up to start opening it up. Single arm, single leg also. But for that movement, as an example, we'll do some single arm stuff. We'll do sometimes with the little plates, we're sort of simulating the crossover symmetry stuff. We're trying to warm up the rotators, like Cuban press, like all those different variations that will help. So it's hard for me to say like what's the best one because it's day dependent, right? You're going to squat, like we try to introduce to the athletes in a given class, like let's say like 6 things over the course of the warm up. That is a warm up, like a prehab, right? Then the next week, we don't always, in a given week, we don't really double dip on the thing, right? Like, so if we do single leg glute bridge one day on a Monday, we don't do that again until the following week. We did today actually. And so we're cognizant of mixing those up because then it's like, we have a library of prehab movements for every day. So whether it's a hinging day or a squat day, which are related, those two, or it's an overhead day, or it's a gymnastic pulling day, like we prescribe different warm-up stuff, which is essentially what I'm getting at is we essentially do the prehab and warm-up. It's just not very long per se. Like you might do like 3 movements twice, right? In our warm-ups is often how we do it. Do 1, 2, and 3, change the variation, do it again. That's a common way that we warm up. And so, yeah, like basically we just pull out of the library for the day and they are prehab stuff, right? And I think that is like super valuable for me as an athlete. It's very valuable, like not just because I'm getting older. Like I was a baseball player. I have like shoulder issues that I've dealt with for 20 years. But for other people, it can be low back or hip or whatever. And so I think the best one that you can use are once we've exposed you over, let's say in a month of squat days, right? We have like heavy squat once a week for a month. Over those 4 sessions, you've been exposed to different glute and midline warmups. And then in theory, like the concept that I'm sort of in the back of my head thinking is like the athlete knows which one works best for them, right? So I personally, like I tore my ACL a couple of years, like I basically always warm up with box facing negatives. Like I don't always program that because we're varying like what warm up for what movement and what day and how often are we repeating it. But like I know that one is very helpful for me. So I like it wasn't in the warm up today, but I did it personally for my training. And so I'll go through like as an athlete, I pick and choose which ones from the library that I know work best for me, right? And so in theory, that's a way that an athlete could do the class, right? Like do what we're doing, having them do in warm up. We sort of have 2 phases of warm up. As you know, we have like the unilateral warm up and then we have the movement specific warm up, both of which include prehab stuff. And so if you as an athlete start to know like, oh, I really need inchworms when we go upside down, like you start to use that even if we didn't program it that day.
Mm-hmm.
Over the course of a month, you've been exposed to basically all of the prehab stuff that we would incorporate, which we've learned over time. Like I have been at a PT quite a bit with that knee surgery, and shoulder stuff that I've dealt with and so forth. So I've learned from the PT who we have a good relationship with, like, and they're accessible. Like you can learn them. I'm sure you learn them. You do like hip bridge a lot, like weighted glute bridge, right? Or hip whatever you call
Thrusters.
it. Hip thrusters, right? And so like that's one that I don't program that, but like that's a fine thing to do, right? And so you're not the only one who does that. There's athletes who have found that that's an effective thing for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the best one is really the ones that once you know the library, like you have found work for you for that movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your snatch prehab is probably different than my snatch. You know what I mean? So it's hard to give like a one size fits all.
Yeah.
But if you individually as an athlete, this should go for any athlete really, but you could always come to us and be like, what's the library of snatch warmups? And I'll just show it to you. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, this is what we incorporate. And if you're like, oh yeah, those 4 are the best for me out of the 12, like whether that might be like a banded overhead carry, like with the kettlebell, like that's not something we do every day, but that might be the best for you.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's not a great answer to your question, but
no, it's interesting because I don't think people necessarily realize all of that behind the scenes lesson planning, like you're saying, of I have my library of these things that I know go for each kind of movement, and I'm not going to be repeating them because I want people to be exposed. But when you're in class and you're just following directions, sometimes it's not computing.
No, 100%. And part of that benefit is that the athlete doesn't always, like, you like to know, and we love when the athletes are cerebral, we're like a bunch of nerds. And so we like when they ask questions and want to know, but some people love that. They're like, I don't want to think about anything. Just tell me what to do, coach. Right. Like, I don't care what the best snatch warm up is for me. I just want to do the snatch warm up that we're doing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but, for people who are more like aware or dealing with an injury or like that kind of stuff, like that is always a fine thing. We're not like a dictatorship, right? So if so-and-so needs to change their warm-up, like we mentioned before, Nat, about the double unders, right? So if we have an athlete who's like, I need to practice double unders, and the warm-up is like bike 30 seconds out of 6 count breathing, and then, do this other thing and do this other thing, and then go back on the bike. We're telling them to jump rope instead of the bike. Part of that is on the athlete to know, like, they want to do this thing, or like, they need this specific warm up, with hip circles, for example, like we don't have enough hip circles for me to program that for a group of 25. And that's a movement where we sometimes handpick the athletes in class who have like big glute activation problems or issues. And we'll be like, okay, now that the group just took the barbells out and they're starting to load up, you go take the hip circles, and in between your warm-up sets, like do the monster walks or do your ice or whatever. So, but you're very good at that as an athlete. Like, you're aware of that kind of stuff.
I think that just comes from injury.
But that's
learning the hard way.
Yeah. Not for nothing. That's how most of us become aware, either aging or when we become aware of that kind of stuff. Right. And so that's not like a bad answer. That's just sort of like inevitable. Right.
Yeah. It just happens.
Yeah. The youngsters, they just want to rip the bar at 225 right when they walk in the door,
and they can.
Yep. They sure can. But us more senior folks need to do a little more.